The last tutorial that we'll look at with the bank multiplier is calculating how much money is created, or how much additional money there is available for people to spend from a deposit. The first step is to write down the formula for calculating the required reserves. The required reserves formula is deposit times the required reserve ratio. 2. Substitute the deposit made by the individual into the formula. 3. Substitute the required reserve ratio into the formula and multiply the deposit required by the required reserve ratio. Our next step is to go through the process of calculating the amount of excess reserves. We do this by writing down the formula for calculating the excess reserves, which is deposit minus required reserves. Next, we'll substitute in the deposit made by the individual into the formula. Next, we substitute in the required reserves into the formula. Next, we subtract the required reserves from the deposit. Our next step is to calculate the bank multiplier. So we're going to need to write down the formula for calculating the bank multiplier, 1 divided by the reserve ratio, substitute the reserve ratio into the formula, and then divide 1 by the reserve ratio. The final step in the process is to calculate the actual amount of money that is put in the actual increase in the money supply. This is done by writing down the formula for calculating the amount of money added to the economy from a deposit, which is excess reserves times the bank or money multiplier. Next, we'll substitute in the amount of excess reserves into the formula. Next, we'll substitute in the bank or money multiplier into the formula. And finally, we'll multiply the amount of excess reserves times the bank or money multiplier. Let's look at an example. A bank receives a deposit of $1,000. The government requires the bank to keep 10% of its money in reserve. How much does the money supply increase as a result of the $1,000 deposit? The first step is that we need to calculate the amount of money that the bank is required to keep. So we need to find out what the bank's required reserves are. To do that, we need to multiply the deposit times the reserve requirement ratio. In this case, the deposit is $1,000. And so we will substitute in $1,000 in for deposit in the formula for the bank reserves. Our next step is to find out how much the bank is required to keep. In this example, the bank is required to keep 10% of its money in reserve. So we're going to substitute in the 10% into the formula. Notice that we convert the 10% into a decimal number. We can do that by typing in on a calculator the reserve requirement in percentage, press the divide key, and then type 100 and then the equal sign. This will convert the reserve requirement into a decimal number. Our next step is to multiply the amount of the deposit by the reserve requirement, or the required reserve ratio. In this case, we have 1,000 times 0.10, which means the bank is required to keep $100. Since we know that the required reserve is $100, the next thing we need to do is to find out the excess reserves. We're going to do this by using the formula deposit minus required reserves. In this case, the bank receives a deposit of $1,000, and so we will substitute that in for the deposit in the formula. Substituting the $1,000 into the formula for deposit, our next step is to put in the amount of money that the bank is required to keep on hand. In this case, the required reserves are $100. So we substitute $100 into the formula. Our next step is to subtract from 1,000 $100, or 1,000 minus 100. This gives us 900. So the banks are required to keep and are able to loan out $900. Our next step is to figure out the bank multiplier. To do this, we will need the formula for the bank multiplier, which is 1 divided by the reserve ratio. Looking back at our problem, we see that the government requires the bank to keep 10% of its money in reserve, and so we will substitute in the 10% into the formula, noting that we convert the percent into a decimal number by typing in on the calculator 10, the divide sign, 100, and then equal, and that will convert it over to a decimal number so that we can substitute it into the formula. Our next step is to divide 1 by 0.10, and this gives us a bank multiplier or a money multiplier of 10. So the bank multiplier is 10. Our final step is to figure out how much money is created from the deposit of $1,000. To do that, we need to multiply the excess reserves times the bank multiplier. In this case, our excess reserves are $900, so we substitute 900 into the formula. Our bank multiplier is 10, so we substitute 10 into the formula. Our next step is to multiply 900 by 10, which gives us 9,000. This means that a deposit of $1,000 into a bank adds $9,000 to the amount of money in circulation when the reserve ratio is 10%.